I think a lot of it is empathy and curiosity for the world around you and just continuing to understand that how you live in the world isn't the same as your neighbor, and that we're in a moment in time where I don't think indifference is the option. But I also think I'm very optimistic because now more than ever, what you're seeing in the world is just the power of creativity and the creative practice to accelerate us through some of these very difficult times.
I'm Ran Dror, and this is Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. In each episode, I talk to someone who's trying to change our lives for the better in some meaningful way, whether through a new product, new venture, or a new way of looking at the world. And I try to understand how they came to it, what makes them tick, and what we can learn from them. Today I'm talking to Greg Hoffman. Greg is Nike's former chief marketing officer, a global brand leader, advisor, and speaker, and the author of Emotion by Design, Creative Leadership Lessons from a Life at Nike. In his book, Greg shares lessons and stories on the power of creativity drawn from almost 3 decades of experience within the company. It's a celebration of creativity and a call to arms for brand builders to rediscover the human element that makes consumer bonds. We talked in mid-June 2022, and I was looking forward to talking to Greg because Nike clearly is doing some amazing work around branding and brand values, and is able again and again to create authentic connections at scale. I'm a latecomer to the world of branding. For much of my life, I was an avid product person and saw the brand as an afterthought. It's only in recent years that I understood the extent to which our lives, our thinking, and our decisions are driven by the stories we tell and the emotional associations we make. The art of doing that well is branding, and it can be used for good or evil, and is just as important in nonprofits and political organizations as it is in business. We may wish for a world where people are always making totally rational decisions. Or we can live in this world where most of us, most of the time, go with our guts because we just don't have the time and capacity to research every single decision. And if we go with our guts, the art of informing our guts and our gut feelings is called branding. It was fascinating to hear from Greg about how he developed his love of art and design sensibility, growing up in branding inside of Nike until eventually becoming chief marketing officer, the importance of emotion and storytelling, on authenticity and why chasing cool is a bad idea, on creativity as a team sport, and on the importance of courage. I really enjoy the stories of some of Nike's iconic campaigns, digging in to find compelling ways to tell stories that illustrate and support your values in a real way. Feels like a very human way of crafting a brand that people can believe in. Now, I've counted the episodes we already have recorded and edited for you, and it's currently 8 episodes. There are famous designers like Vicky Tan and John Maeda, authors like Susie Weiss and Ashish Goyal, and the most connected men in the world, Chris Dancy among them. We release conversations weekly with thinkers, designers, makers, authors, entrepreneurs, and activists who are working to change our world for the better. So follow this podcast on your favorite podcast app or head over to remakepod.org to subscribe. And now let's jump right in with Greg Hoffman. All right, I'm sitting here with Greg Hoffman. Greg, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the opportunity and the conversation.
So these days we usually start with a check-in because COVID is still out there. Things are still happening in the world. So we'd like to ask what it's like to be you these days.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because I just recovered from my second bout of COVID, and doing that during a book launch as well has been challenging. But at the same time, I've, like I think everyone else, been as resourceful as possible and just trying to move through that and take advantage of this really opportunity I've been given and platform to share my point of view on creativity and design and innovation. I feel very thankful and grateful for that.
Yeah, we spoke a little bit before we started, and you said you've been doing a lot of podcast interviews recently. And it's nice that today you can sit in your own house and record interviews all around the world. And so we like to start this exploration by understanding the person a little bit and their background. And so we come up with this opening question that our listeners sort of expect, which is, what's something you've learned in childhood or early in life that still drives or guides you today?
Yeah, well, it's a great question, because I think so much of what drives us, I think, starts to manifest itself in those early years. And certainly for me, as someone who had a deep passion for creativity and design and art, as well as sports, a lot of that passion came from being a bit of an outsider as a child, because I was the only person of color in my school system and my suburb that I lived in. And I was an adoptee as well. So even within my own home. So I turned to sports and art as an escape, if you will, and dove headfirst into that. So those outlets served me well then, but also that early interest in art and design was the rocket fuel that allowed me, I think, to not only lead global design and marketing teams around the world, but also use some of those feelings I had growing up and not always feeling like I was invited into the room, if you will, and use that as motivation to make sure that when I achieved a level of influence, that I could use the power of creativity and design to break down barriers for others that maybe also were the only person like themselves in the room.
Mm. You talked about growing up in the age of color blindness, or not seeing color being kind of the standard approach, and that didn't sit well with you. So I'd love to understand, what would you have wished for as a kid that you were missing, and then how were you able to bring that later into your teams?
Yeah, from a personal standpoint, as a child or even a teenager, and experiencing different levels of racism and bias, some direct, some latent, if you will, but not necessarily having the people to talk to about it or the allies to share your experience with on that, because maybe the empathy didn't necessarily exist because the approach was a bit different in terms of focus more of your time on making sure that you're not seeing the differences, if you will. Your focus is focusing on the similarities. And in fact, today, it's a different environment, of course. And I think the whole point is realizing that your daily lived in experience and how you operate within the world is different than the next person. And I think certainly in our line of work, right, the creative practices, all of it starts with having a deep level of empathy for the subject matter, whether it's an individual, a community, an entire city, right? To peel back those layers and realize what those unique experiences are. And so obviously, having some outlets growing up to be able to express how I was feeling would have made for maybe a more inspiring experience, if you will. But at the same time, I want to be clear, all of those formative years were influential in bringing me to where I am today, and how I see the ability for all of us to be creative cultural leaders. And whether you're a leader of one yourself or a leader of many.
Yeah, this is sometimes in the weird alchemy of growing up, the things that are most difficult for us seems to give us the powers that we develop early in life that then stay with us for life. So one of those powers is actually I think your design sensibility and your creative side. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about, how did that develop as a young person, as a child?
Yeah, a great question. And as all of us have these hidden talents that we are born with, but they will just simply lie dormant unless we have individuals in our lives or environments where they're drawn out, right? And so I was lucky enough that my parents recognized at an early age that I love to use my imagination and put that on paper through drawing, and really motivated me to draw every single day. And so much so that I shared a bedroom with my two brothers, this really small bedroom. We didn't have a lot back then. So you have 3 beds in this bedroom. And then they took one of the walls and put a wood picture frame around the entire wall and painted it white and said, "This is your mural, and you can draw and paint anything you want on it." I drew superheroes, and I drew a lot of logos and brand marks of my favorite teams. To have that level of support and people recognize how important it is to do what you love really opened a door. And then I just got really fortunate as a 15-year-old, actually. I had gotten a job in a publishing company, a small little publishing company, a boutique company, and I worked in their warehouse. But one day I asked, what are people doing in this particular apartment outside the warehouse? And they said, that's the art department. That's where they design the book covers and the layouts for the books and do illustrations. And somehow I got up the confidence, and I'm not sure how, right? Because I was pretty introverted as a kid. And I went in and asked if I could work within that art department starting at 15 years old during the summers. And in short time, I was doing page layouts, I was doing illustrations. And so at an early age, as a teenager, I learned that you could make a living doing your art. And that was a big springboard that led me on this particular journey.
Designers always have a story somewhere in their teenage years where they actually experience design. I've been to a designer event recently. These are top designers from some of the top tech companies. And many designers said that the first time they used Photoshop was when they tried to make a fake ID to get alcohol when they were 15 or 16.
That's fantastic.
And it just stuck. Yeah.
Well, as a father of 2 college-age kids who I'm sure are running around with fake IDs as well, that's both funny and alarming.
Well, alarming, or it could end up well because all these people ended up working for Google and Facebook and other companies. And so, that kind of leads us into what you do at Nike and what you did at Nike, because I think you joined as a graphic design intern and rose up the ranks. What was it like to first join Nike, and then what was that journey like up the ranks or to ending up as the chief marketing officer and then the VP of global brand innovation and being leading all these people?
Yeah, I had come into the brand as someone who was deeply focused on the craft of graphic design, and oftentimes really obsessed with how things looked, right? I hadn't yet gotten into that frame of mind where I was asking a lot of questions about how I wanted the audience to feel, right? Back to that idea of emotion. It wasn't until I walked through the door at Nike and I started to be a part of these conversations where there was so much time spent, whether it was a logo or as a poster or it was a store, these questions about asking how they wanted an individual or an athlete or a consumer to feel, not only about the brand and its products and its services, but how they wanted the consumer to feel about themselves and their ability to achieve great things and their aspirations. And so to walk in the door and get that dose of just do it, right? That iconic slogan, wasn't just external facing to the world. It was something that was discussed often internally. And so that was really eye-opening because, to be quite honest, we hadn't talked a lot about that in design college, right? Because so much of your time is spent on obsessing the details and craftsmanship and composition and color theory, all incredibly important. But you could argue that's in some ways the science of design. And then I started to really get a crash course in emotional storytelling. You'd walk into a meeting, and just the way certain leaders would present their work as a story versus a project was quite eye-opening. And that every single output from the brand had to be connected in some way. So back to that idea of design thinking and creating holistic, connected experiences, that started really early on that. And so finally, maybe the last thing I would say is, again, growing up obsessed with the branding within sports, I started to have, I guess, subconsciously an idea of what marketing was, right? What brand building was. And as I moved through those ranks, starting to be able to exercise my creative mindset and expertise to satisfy both the rational and emotional needs of the audience through a solution. And that's really where I became a bit of a hybrid, right? So someone who was equally obsessed with brand strategy and brand creativity.
And so, we have all sorts of people listening to this. Some are designers, but maybe more product designers or design thinkers. And I think even with myself, it wasn't until relatively late in my career that I started thinking about branding as taking it seriously. And so I actually would love to hear your definition of what is branding, and then we'll get into why it matters.
Yeah, sure. Let's start at the very beginning. Really, branding is about two things. One, creating an impression in the consumer's mind of your brand and creating associations about that brand that the consumer has. But again, that's just the beginning. Creating an impression in the consumer's mind is a journey, right? It starts with creating brand awareness, and then it starts to create brand affinity and brand recognition. And so you really move up this brand development tree. The highest point, of course, is when you're the first choice. When they think of that category and you immediately come to mind. But to achieve that, back to the book Emotion by Design, you need to be intentional about, as people say, appealing to both the head and the heart, the rational and functional needs of your audience and the emotional side, right? How do you make them feel when they interact with your products and services? And so that's what the best brands do, and that's what the best creative teams do.
I want to play devil's advocate, so I'm going to play the role of an uber rational thinker. And they might ask you, what is this voodoo? I don't want you to manipulate my emotions, just give me the facts. Then you wrote a book, Emotion by Design, which we'll dive into. But why are emotions important for selling products? Why is that so key?
First and foremost, let me be clear. If you're not satisfying a real need in an exceptional way, then it's going to be really hard for someone to tune in to what you have to say if you're trying to invite them to be part of a higher purpose. So you must satisfy a need, whether you're an automobile company, a food and beverage, or sneakers, right? So how will this product make me better than I was the day before? But with that kind of rational, functional pursuit, the emotional side, let's go with the world of sport. When I put that uniform on, right, I not only feel protected, but I feel a sense of pride. I feel like a superhero. It directly affects your performance and outlook on the moment and on life. So that's what I mean. And there's so many different elements that play a role in doing that. Obviously, the role of color and what colors mean, just the differences between typography and typefaces and what they communicate and say, but also how they make us feel. Even sound design. What does it sound like when you open a car door and sit in that seat and turn the ignition? Well, yes, that is about function and getting to where you need to go. But there are so many different signals that are also making you feel confident or uplifted. I don't look at it as manipulation. I look at it as
Mm,
serving all the senses in the most holistic way
mm,
possible. Sure, this is a business. And at the end of the day, you need to drive business growth. But I always believe revenue and sales is a byproduct and a consequence of a great brand strategy, right? And so versus starting the conversation with, we need to drive a lot of sales, right? And so how are we going to do that? Versus how are we going to
mm,
serve a real human need in a way that is distinctive and differentiated than everyone else in a particular category. And in doing so, we will create a significant business advantage from that. But it's like keeping the teams
mm,
locked in on what their role is on that.
mm.
Certainly, as designers, I just think we have this amazing platform and we sit in this rarefied air, if you will, because you set it up early on in our conversation of just the stakes of society today and everything that's going on in the world. And I just think designers can play a greater role through their creativity and their curiosity and empathy to not only satisfy business needs, but change the world at the same time.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, I think even the most, the people who think of themselves as the most rational, they're driven by emotional decisions. They might have affinity for more rational brands, for more techie brands. But in the end, I think the less you acknowledge the role of emotions, the more you are blind to its role in your life and its power. And so putting storytelling front and center and saying this is what we stand for, there's also a commitment in that, right? Like it also forces you to behave a certain way as a brand.
No question. Look, we all wake up in the morning and we have a daily ritual. And even the most analytical minded person has products and services that they use within that day that they just simply can't live without, right? They have a
Mm,
complete emotional bond with those, and they'd be pretty miserable if they, like for me, it's my Nespresso machine. It's not just my
mm,
ability to get an espresso, it's from the Nespresso brand. I'm part of that community. I've been with them
mm,
on this journey. It makes me feel a certain way because of the overall kind of brand community and story that I get to be a part of, even if a lot of it is
mm,
unconscious. I talk a lot about this idea of making sure you understand that every opportunity, every detail, every interaction with your consumer is an opportunity to reveal something about yourself as a brand, no matter how small. And that's why I talk a lot about making sure that it's not content, it's story. Because saying
mm,
you need content to distribute is different mentality than saying you need to tell your brand story and share it with the world.
mm,
So I do think
mm,
words matter. And I think creating a team mindset that values the craft of design and storytelling matters as well. And so there's just little shifts in the vernacular and the way you speak about your practice and the output of your brand can be very helpful to your internal culture.
mm. You seem to care about authenticity quite a bit, and you have a phrase, "Don't chase cool." So help me understand what makes a brand authentic. You can't fake
Yeah,
authenticity, but how do you
that's true.
craft it?
Yeah, it's a great question because we live in an age where I think there is a chase that goes on, chasing the latest influencer, a brand ambassador who's hot in the moment to
Mm,
represent your product, chasing the latest social media platform or capability, or jumping in to the conversation about NFTs and Web 3.0, et cetera, before maybe
mm,
understanding who you are to begin with, right? So, my point about don't chase cool is making sure you understand that your authenticity is the currency that you lead with. And I'll give you an example. The Air Force One
Mm,
sneaker was designed in 1982 at Nike. And here we are in
mm,
2022, 40 years later, and it is the largest selling sneaker by volume in the US,
mm,
right? But it's also the most aspirational shoe because it's the most influential sneaker in culture. So, my point there
mm,
is that it was designed for performance in the beginning, right? And every step of the way, any story that's been told about that Air Force One sneaker comes from an authentic place, an authentic origin. If you're
mm,
introducing a specific colorway, it comes from a specific basketball court somewhere around the world, or it comes from a specific game where a player scored a specific number of points. So even today,
mm,
as these sneakers are worn for style on the street, they're still standing on the shoulders of those authentic stories and the fact that it was built for performance first and foremost. And Nike's never forgot that. I think sometimes when brands lose their way, when they are chasing cool, it's because either for a minute or a while, they might not be completely clear on who they are and why they exist. Or they might just need to
mm,
reaffirm it. And I'm a big believer in making sure you're always publishing your brand values and your mission and vision. Where are you going and how are you going to get there and who do you serve? And making sure that's crystal
mm,
clear to every single employee at your company. And thankfully, I was
mm,
part of a culture for almost 3 decades that was committed to always making sure everyone was clear on why we existed as a brand in the first place. And it was
mm,
from that we were able to show up with status and influence within the world of culture, both inside the world of sport and how it intersected with art, music, design, etc.
mm. But you gave the example of the Air Force One, and another positive example that comes to mind for me is like the Think Different campaign that Apple did, where those were carefully chosen individuals that Apple wanted to associate with people who were rebels,
That's right.
thought different. Yeah. Is there? Can you give me an example of something that didn't work quite so well? Something, maybe something that people would know that didn't reach that authenticity. Yeah.
Here's what I would say is I think people can relate to this, especially over the last maybe 2 years, is how often have you been watching TV or streaming service and an ad comes up and it's clear that whoever this company is trying to create positive change in the world using their platform to say something, but it isn't until the end of that commercial where you see the logo of
Mm,
the company that you realize who it even is, right? And so that's where I think there's maybe a failure to connect what you sell with what you're trying to say and what the world needs at a given moment of time, right? When you're trying to use your platform and take a stand, you have to be crystal clear about how it connects to who you are and what you do. And so that's where maybe I've seen misses as brands look to create social impact and highlight the inequities in the world, but it's maybe a bit confusing as to why either they're speaking up in the moment or how it relates to who they are as a brand and what they sell. And a lot of times it just comes down to making sure you have enough different perspectives, experiences, and diversity in the room as you're working on those concepts and those campaigns to ensure that you have people that are looking through different lenses. And
mm,
out of that, the work will be much more powerful. It will be on brand and it will move people, your audiences, in ways that create action and change.
mm. No. So one ad that really didn't work quite so well is the Pepsi ad, with the Kardashian walking around and opening the can, and that kind of fixes everything. And that didn't get the reaction that they were hoping for. That didn't seem like it made the right connections.
Again, I always like, what's the learning? And I believe the learning is that oftentimes we're so close to the work. Our heads are down, it's right in front of us, and we don't have those different points of view pressure testing what we're doing. And oftentimes the test has to be, if you're in a group, if it's a sea of sameness and we all grew up the same way, then it's going to be really hard for us to create something that provides a profoundly new perspective on an old theme, but does it in a way that's quite inspirational and doesn't come across as tone deaf. There is this incredible commitment that we see now to creating diverse representation within your teams, but it's only diversely represented if you allow people to activate their personal experience and perspective in the workplace, in those rooms, when they're working on those products, those campaigns, those services, right? Otherwise, you might have the most diverse team in your sector, but people are restrained from being able to lean in to where they came from, what they believe, how they experienced life. Sometimes diversity is simply looked at by the numbers, right? And of course, you can make a lot of progress that way. But the question is, how is it showing up in the day-to-day process in which you create and work? When I talk about emotion by design being a guide to unlock creativity within your brand, part of it is unlocking the diversity within your brand.
You're listening to Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. If you're listening on a podcast app, you already know how to follow podcasts. So please follow this one. If you're listening in a browser, just go to remakepod.org to find links to all the major podcast players where you can follow our show. You talk about the importance of courage in that process, and that seems to be part of what you're talking about here. The courage of people who need to listen, the courage of people who need to speak. Tell me more about courage and why it's important in this process.
Yeah, developing a culture of risk-taking, I think, is really important. And developing a culture where failure isn't the end. Failure is part of the process of achieving successful innovation. I believe, and certainly in my roles leading different brand innovation groups, my job was to incentivize risk-taking, to make sure that you had a protected space to create. Sometimes my job was to make sure that the business pressures, that the team in some ways was protected from that, to make sure that they were pushing the edges and the boundaries enough. And then part two is that you have forums to hear unique ideas that might, quite frankly, be outside of the normal business plan. And so part of some of the stories in emotion design is there's so many ideas that just started with a simple conversation between a couple people, asking the question, what if or why not? And oftentimes, some of the biggest business ideas come from just being in a space where you don't have to ask for permission to use your imagination. My favorite ad of all time, commercial, if you will, is one I didn't work on, but it really brings home this idea of taking risks. And it's the Michael Jordan failure commercial. He's the greatest basketball athlete in the world, certainly of my generation. And here he is saying, I've missed 9,000 shots. I've lost 300 games, and 25 times I've been asked to take the game-winning shot, and I've missed. And yet, because I failed over and over again, that is why I succeed. And I think that's quite powerful and a reminder that you need to create the confidence within each individual to receive the ball and take that shot when it matters most. That's part of our role as leaders. And if they miss, it's not the end. That's the price of innovation.
No, which is a great message both for athletes and for team members, internal team members in taking risks. There are two other iconic campaigns that I'd love to hear your thoughts on. One is the Many Londons campaign that you describe in the book. That's struck home. So how did that come about?
Yes, happy to share that. And a perfect example of the importance of curiosity and empathy at the beginning of the creative process, because the strongest outcomes can only happen if you're starting with a sharp and deep insight, right? And so in 2012, the Olympics were in London. And as you can imagine, every brand is going to come with their campaign that features the greatest athletes in the world. And at the beginning of our process of thinking about how we want to inspire people around the world during the games, the Wine & Kennedy team came into the room and said, hey, we've essentially made this discovery. And the discovery is this, and this is early on in the process, that there are 29 Londons around the world: London, India, London, Nairobi. And within these different towns called London, there are also people competing every day in their own Olympics. And we should celebrate that during a time when the Olympians are on that world stage. And so we brought to life the Find Your Greatness campaign, which really highlighted that London is everywhere, and greatness isn't for a chosen few. We all have greatness within us. It's not a birthright. And it's just important for us to realize that and through our own definition of greatness and achieve that. And you could argue that that's the definition of just do it, right? Is that a lot of my role was to lead teams to broaden the definition of sport and what it meant to be an athlete, right? Because sometimes we default in these traditional definitions of what certain things are. And in some ways, you have to debunk that and open up the aperture and create more accessibility into whatever a category or sector you're working within.
Yeah. And the beautiful thing to me in this story is this idea of the Many Londons connected in a very real way with the message that you were already trying to put out there, that greatness is, can be in everyone, and that everyone is an athlete. And so that connection created something really authentic. And another really authentic, I actually watched this on YouTube right before we got on the call, and I teared up. It's the Colin Kaepernick Believe in Something campaign. And the remarkable thing, I think, is not many companies could have gotten away with something like this, just in terms of the reaction of the viewer, but it feels completely authentic. The message is, it's only crazy until you do it. Just do it and believe in something, even if it means sacrificing everything. And it ties in all of these different stories. So yeah, I'd love to hear, your take about this, and why is Nike able to do something like this?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, it's important to understand that the campaign was part of a legacy of standing up or fighting against racial injustice or championing racial equality. And certainly going back to 2006 with the Stand Up, Speak Up campaign to fight racism in the sport of global football, or 2017 when we launched the Nike Equality campaign, where there was just so much unfortunate violence in the world, and specifically in America, that was becoming just too consistent of a theme. And so coming into 2017, when I was chief marketing officer, Colin Kaepernick came to the Nike headquarters, and I sat next to him that summer for lunch, and he didn't have a team to play for. That was the sacrifice he had made.
Yeah.
And so we listen to his words, but here's that important message of making sure you not only have a diverse set of expertises in the room, but diverse experiences and perspectives as well. Because as I sat next to Colin, I was struck by our similar early backgrounds because Colin and I are both biracial. We're both half black, half white, and we're also both adoptees. We were adopted by white parents and grew up that way. And so the lens I looked through as chief marketing officer was in some ways as that kid growing up and as someone who's never been able to separate my personal life from my professional life and those experiences. So certainly I left the room that day knowing that we would use our platform and our position to amplify his voice and his cause in the most authentic way possible through the lens and platform of sport.
Yeah. Taking that energy, I want to ask you to maybe take a step back and think about the place where we are in the world today. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about how can emotional design and brand change the world for the better? What are the problems? What are the challenges that we can, if we were more mindful of this aspect, could do a better job with?
It's a great question. There's so many different areas that need our creative vision and expertise. And there's so many different individuals and communities that don't have access to all the amazing talents that we have. And so it's our job, as they say, more evenly distribute all the amazing talent that exists in the world in these creative communities to create a more inclusive future for everyone. Let me give you maybe a specific example for the listeners. Let's just look at maybe homelessness or creating housing or low income or affordable housing. Oftentimes, these structures serve the functional needs, right? But they say nothing about the communities that will be living within them. And I think it's important to sit with those communities to understand their histories, to understand their hopes and dreams. That's why I say we need to design dreams, not just satisfying the need, but at the same time, satisfying the emotional need as well. So that when you're inviting someone to live within an environment and within a space, they can see themselves within that space, that there are elements within the architecture or the environmental design that are representative of where they've come from. And so we can make choices early on in the process to ensure that something is designed to be inviting, to be uplifting, to be motivating. And at the end of the day, we want people to have pride in where they live. I think if you're a product designer, and I think sometimes you collectively as a team, you need to pull up and think about what communities don't have access to your innovation and inspiration. And is there a way you can reach into some of these different communities? And I always use the example of up until 3 or 4 years ago, if you were an athlete and you competed with a hijab head covering, there was no performance fabric designed hijab, whether you're an athlete at the Olympic level or the amateur level. And so you could imagine, and I use this example of fencers with those head coverings, when you perspire and it gets moisture, it hardens and you can't hear that well, and you can't hear the referee's signals. And what was happening is oftentimes athletes would get false starting times. So that's a significant disadvantage, and it's not a level playing field. And so Nike created the Nike Pro hijab with fabric that moved with you, that had moisture management. And it's that idea of, again, bringing something that might even exist within your catalog of innovation, but bringing that out into places where certain individuals or groups didn't have an invitation to use it or be a part of that. So I think a lot of it is empathy and curiosity for the world around you, and just continuing to understand that how you live in the world isn't the same as your neighbor, and that we're in a moment in time where I don't think indifference is the option. But I also think I'm very optimistic, because now more than ever, what you're seeing in the world is just the power of creativity and the creative practice to accelerate us through some of these very difficult times.
Mm, mm. So, the final closing question that we usually ask, probably related to some of the themes that we just talked about. So, in his TED Talk, the philosopher Alain de Botton talks about the difference between a lecture and a sermon. A lecture being a dry, modern day, secular way of delivering some information, and you decide what to do with it. And a sermon, which he longs for, he's calling for more sermons, is an urgent plea to change someone's life. And so I would like to ask you, if you could give a short sermon today to the whole world, what would it be about?
Well, I believe we need to be more human in the future. And I believe brands need to be more human in the future, because we're living in this age of automation and this digital revolution. And it's brought us a lot. It's given us great capabilities to deliver what our audiences want at greater speed, with greater productivity and greater personalization. But at the same time, I believe it's given us less creativity, less innovation, less radical creative concepts, if you will. I believe it's time for us to be more human, because humans take risks, humans empathize, humans are curious, humans collaborate, and humans design emotion. And so at the end of the day, humans leave legacies. So as brands, let's leave a legacy we can be proud of.
Thank you so much, Greg. I appreciate your time today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Remake is produced by myself and Regina Rothstein. Research and editing by Louis Brady. And audio engineering by Greg Cocoveos. If you enjoyed the podcast, please consider writing a 5-star review in Apple's podcast or wherever you're listening. It helps many more people discover the podcast, and also just makes us feel good. Current support for the podcast comes from my own design company, Remake Labs. We're a global strategic design sprint agency aimed at improving outcomes through repeated and rapid design interventions. Now, until next time, be well, everyone, and see you next week on Remake.